All right, and Susan Boyd joins me now from Victoria, British Columbia. I assume that you're in Victoria, Susan, are
No,
you?
I'm actually in, Vancouver. I live in Vancouver, but I
Okay, in
was,
Vancouver.
faculty at University of Victoria.
Yes, you are a distinguished professor, is your status there still. So that's very
Yes.
exciting. So thank you very much for joining me from out west today. How you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Terrific. And here to talk about Heroin, an illustrated history, your new book from our friends over at Fernwood Press. So, Susan, before we get into some of the specifics of the book, could you walk us through a little bit of your background, right? We have a lot of historians on the show. You're there, you've done a lot of interdisciplinary work. So, what has your career been to get you to a point where you're writing this book about the history of heroin?
Well, my background's in criminology and women's studies, and sort of sociological, perspectives on crime, and, my first research, that I conducted was doing interviews with women who used, criminalized drugs, mothers. Because I felt like their voice wasn't heard in the academic literature. And in order to understand sort of where we are, where we were then, I looked at the history of drug control, as well as looking at the regulation of women through child protection and social services and through the healthcare system. So I'm not a historian per se, but I felt that I needed to understand better the setting that current things occurred in. And from there, I went on to write several other books. And in those books, I talked about drug issues more in a socio-historical framework, I think you could say. I've just always been interested in, as many other writers are, how the past shapes or affects our present day and our future, trying to understand what's going on in contemporary society by looking to the past. And with my books, I started to move as well, providing imagery in the books. In a book that I did with Bud Osborne, who's um, a renowned poet in the downtown East Side, an activist, and Donald McPherson, we authored the book Raise Shit. And in that book, we included imagery from the downtown East Side and different events in relation to the history of the harm reduction movement in Vancouver at that time. And I started to look at imagery quite different because I've done a study on drug films, looking at fictional drug films, Canadian, US films, and from the UK as well. And analyzing sort of the narratives, but also the visual imagery in those films. And more, I started to recognize that images are telling a story as well. And they're, when that image was created, it tells a story from that moment in history too. So in my last two books, I wrote Busted, an illustrated history of drug prohibition in Canada. In that book, I used images and text again to tell the story of the history of drug prohibition. In my most current book, Heroin, an illustrated history, I'm utilizing the same framework in the sense of going back to historical documents, trying to understand our present day, how we've regulated heroin, how we see people who use heroin, but also using the imagery, whether it be a painting or a poster or a news event, to tell the story too, and focusing on what I would call alternative narratives and imagery to tell the story. Because, especially with heroin, if you look at the images, let's say in a 1950 magazine or in a current film, um, the heroin user is most often demonized and or occasionally romanticized. So I was trying to find alternative narratives because that's a story I wanted to tell after having looked at all of this archival material, sort of House of Commons debates, RCMP, annual
Mhm.
reports from the past, Department of National Health and Welfare annual reports, to bring those into focus with the imagery from that time as well of important events that related to
Right.
heroin regulation. So I've been writing and investigating, I guess you could say, drug policy for almost 30 years. And I find each work, I'm trying to open it up a bit more to understand it better, to understand our current day, and trying to find the language to to write about those events in a way that anybody could understand the book, from a
Mhm.
teenager to a senior citizen, that telling a story. And I'm hoping at the end of that story that they'll think differently about the
Mhm.
issues that I've brought up in the book.
Yeah, and you certainly see it in this book, the connection to today and the accessibility of it certainly. And for something like heroin, that it makes sense. On the surface, you might say like an illustrated history of heroin. What could you actually put? But then you look in the book and you look at what's there. There's so much there from the early days, from its advertisements, from its benefits, and then
Mhm.
of course into the criminalization of it and the war on drugs and all the imagery that comes out in the war on drugs. There is a lot there that allows the book to speak to you in different ways and different levels. And of course, it
Mhm.
does speak to contemporary issues as well. As certainly heroin hasn't gone away from society, and a lot of the issues here mirror other issues with drug use and the criminalization of certain drugs. But let's go back to its discovery, because really heroin is very much a 20th century drug. It's discovered in the late 1890s, and it's put into use for medical purposes early on. And first of all, for anyone who doesn't know, what exactly is heroin? And second, what were the medical benefits or perceived medical benefits when it was first introduced around the turn of the century?
Okay. I should say that right up into the 1800s, all drugs were plant-based. Today, our drugs are mostly synthetic, and it's a chemist who's discovering the drugs. But prior to that, plant medicines were what Canadians and other people around the world used to take care of their health and their family's health. But heroin in itself was discovered in 1874. It's what we call a semi-synthetic drug, and it's derived from morphine, the compound morphine, which is a compound um, in the opium poppy plant. And to morphine, you add acetic acid, and it creates heroin. So if you look at the chemical composition of the two drugs, they're very similar. Diacetylmorphine is the name of the drug, but Bayer Company um, advertised or marketed the drug and branded it heroin. And so it was advertised for pain relief and as a cough suppressant. And it was seen as quite beneficial because you could use a smaller dose for the same effect. So a smaller dose of heroin that you or in comparison to morphine for the same effect, but it was never applied to the many, many ailments that people use, let's say, a opium-based medicine. It was literally just pain relief and as a cough suppressant. So it wasn't as popular as a opium-based medicine um, at all. But at that time, in the late 1800s, if you opened up a medical journal, you might see advertisement by Bayers about this drug and its effectiveness. So the demonization came much, much later. And I think what's interesting about heroin is that right up until the mid 1950s, physicians in Canada prescribed heroin to patients. What got criminalized was the non-medical use of heroin and other drugs like morphine, because we use morphine and heroin and other drugs legally. Safe legal supplies of that are used in pain management and the management of other illnesses. But in Canada, a ban was placed on the importation of heroin into Canada. And so that literally just dried up the domestic supply. And so physicians could no longer prescribe it. But in the early 1920s, the narcotic division of the federal government criminalized the prescribing of legal heroin to anyone who was labeled a known addict. So we criminalized using that drug for people who might be dependent on a narcotic. And what interests me about that is that after we criminalized a long string of drugs, we didn't set up any publicly funded drug treatment or drug substitution programs as other countries did.
Right. And it kind of speaks to a lot of what you see with potentially other drugs. You mentioned opium and the prosecution of opium and opium dens across the
Yes,
country. In the 19th century, that was a major issue that took up a lot of oxygen in the discussion in Ottawa
yes.
around these issues. But when we get into the 1920s, the 1930s, as it relates to heroin, was the harm of heroin, the addictiveness to people
Hmm.
who of course were addicts to heroin, was the issue kind of like what we see now, over prescribing, where doctors are starting to become reliant on this as a form of treatment, and or similarly, was there the quote unquote street market that you might see now, where illicit heroin was being bought and sold outside of any regulatory realm?
Yeah. No, there wasn't. To start off with, people who are using drugs illicitly in Canada were always a very small portion of the population. We
Mm,
never had like a drug panic that was informing our laws. Though, on contemporary news, we've certainly been introduced to this idea of, you know, um, whether it be marijuana grow up, drug panic, or a methamphetamine drug panic, or a crack cocaine drug panic. Um, but it's never been to the extent that the media or law enforcement has suggested. But with heroin itself, legal heroin, there was no red flag or alarms coming out of Canada. It was never a very popular drug, as I said, in the same way that an
mm,
opium-based drug or morphine
right.
was. And even then, there were no claims of overprescribing. It was an international effort that was led by the United States, and then the World Health Organization. Right up from the 1920s on, they wanted to have um, legal sources of heroin banned, that doctors wouldn't be able to prescribe heroin because the US believed that there was diversion into the legal market. But
Mm,
there was no evidence of that. And
right.
in Canada, definitely there was no evidence of that. And today, from a viewpoint today, you would say, well, wouldn't that be better than buying drugs,
Right.
and a poison drug supply? But anyway,
Yeah.
that wasn't part of the equation at that time, but it was very much a US effort to get other Western nations to ban the importation of heroin into their countries, or the production of legal heroin in their countries, because heroin becomes sort of the boogeyman of all drugs. What happened after, in 1908, we enacted our first narcotic law, and that was directed at Chinese Canadians and white people who visited opium dens and were smoking opium. So that was a concern by moral reformers at that time. Nobody cared about the copious amount of liquid opiums that
Sure.
other Canadians were using.
Mm,
And because it was so few opium dens and so few people actually smoking opium, um, some people moved on to using more refined drugs like heroin and morphine, and for some cocaine as well, outside of the opium dens, which no longer existed, or most of
right.
them. And so we see this shift in sort of what I would call drug use patterns. And because people weren't provided a legal drug substitution program, or they had no legal access to these drugs, unless it was for a medical reason. An illegal drug market evolved, because when people want something and it's not being provided for them, they will go to the legal market.
Sure.
So we see this growing illegal market as well at the same time. But the number of people using illegal heroin in Canada was always so quite small. It wasn't even in like the 10,000s. It was down to like 1,000 people or 500 people in the beginning. And maybe to give a good example, like drug convictions don't necessarily give us a mirror in any way of like how many people are using drugs, but over time you can see certain patterns in them. And when we look like even in the 1950s, we can see roughly from 300 to 370 drug convictions occurred in Canada. Well, that's so different than what we've
Right.
had in like the last decade, from 100,000 to like 66,000 in 2020. But of those drug convictions in the 1950s, about 90% were for personal possession convictions, and the majority of those are for heroin.
Hmm.
And BC always sort of led the way, in terms of more convictions in our province here. But it gives you an idea. It wasn't a huge problem, but it had been built up over decades through communication by the Narcotic Division, and the RCMP saw heroin as the number one threat to the nation. And their annual reports and their media communications mirrored this idea that heroin is instantly addicting, that the heroin user was a criminal addict. It was a person who was a criminal first, and their use of heroin or their addiction to heroin was secondary. And so their thinking at that time, the RCMP and the Narcotic Division and some professionals espoused the idea that there's no point to give them drug treatment, even abstinence-based treatment or a drug substitution program where they could be provided legal sources of the drug, because they would still remain a threat to society because they were inherently criminal. And so that
Mm.
was our mindset right up until the late 60s. And it continued. And, I think we still have a bit of that mindset today shaping policy. But it got built up that way. And in the United States, there was a concerted effort as well. And you have to remember that um, Canadians have always read US publications, listened to US radio, watched their films, especially in relation to films. We didn't have, and we still don't have, the same type of Hollywood production
Mhm.
in Canada. And so for many people, where they get their ideas about the drug heroin is through fictional popular culture. And, think about it. It would be very boring to show a film about a heroin user where they just get up, take either an oral dose or injection of their drug, see their family, go off to work, come back, maybe have another dose of their drug, and go to bed. You know what I mean?
Right.
That's
Yeah.
boring.
Yeah.
So to dramatize the drug user, we use all these visual effects. I mean, you're probably familiar with them yourself. Like all of a sudden, that person who looked, possibly well put together, if it's a woman, their hair all of a sudden is out everywhere, their mascara is, you know, um, falling all over their
Mhm.
face. They're looking scrubby.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Well,
and we're seeing images of a needle, injecting
sure.
oneself, often in a background that looks quite dangerous, in an
Mhm.
alley, and abandoning their families, their jobs, all of those depictors of ruin.
Mhm.
And often the outcome of their heroin use is death. Um,
Right.
so that's the message we've gotten for decades about the drug. But just to counterpoint that, when you actually um, see people who are receiving either heroin assisted treatment or heroin prescribed to them, um, you're not seeing any of those indicators. So it begs the question, I think, um, is it the drug, or is it the years of discrimination, like moving through the criminal
Mm,
justice system, being arrested, spending time in prison, being discriminated against through our healthcare system, um, through race, class, and gender injustice, and possibly child protection regulation. What are we actually seeing? And I think when you examine, or when you look at the conclusions in relation to providing legal safe heroin to individuals, that small minority of people who find that conventional treatments fail them, that it's the social environment that they're living in and the discrimination that they've experienced that we're seeing. Because when people are provided legal sources of heroin, they just have a stable, normal life like anybody
mm.
else.
Well, it kind of begs the question of if there's not that many people using it at the time when it is being criminalized, who is using it? What is the average user of heroin? Because we've certainly seen in Canadian history, you mentioned opium dens; those are
Hmm.
pretty much targeted at Chinese Canadians and then the Chinese
Hmm.
Canadian community. We've seen laws passed in Canada that have targeted indigenous communities
Hmm.
for alcohol use, for traditional
Hmm.
drugs. Certainly, it's not just a Canadian issue. If you look at a lot of drug laws in the United States, they're either targeted at or really only prosecuted against the African American community.
Yes.
So, do the laws for heroin and this fear that you're talking about being presented through the course of the 20th century, is there that racial social aspect to it that the laws are there essentially targeting a very specific part of the community?
Yeah. I mean, the laws target, they have right from the beginning, poor people, very visible users, so poor and working class people. And obviously, there has been a race based component to all of our drug laws and all of our police profiling of groups. What we saw in the 50s was that law enforcement was profiling white, poor, and working class heroin users across Canada, but they were still including depictions of the racialized opium trafficker or heroin trafficker. So there's always a component of race. Now you would say that in relation to who's targeted, that it is. There's been a number of studies that just came out in the last couple of years concluding that there's racial profiling going on in relation to drug offenses, and that Indigenous and Black people are overrepresented in those arrests, even though their drug use rates are similar to white Canadians. So there's always a racial component. But in the 50s, there was this fear that was generated about white heroin users. And so that got a lot of attention in the press because it wasn't a racialized group, even though whiteness is a racial category. Um, and I think you could say that for many ways, the narcotic division and law enforcement, they constructed this sort of boogeyman drug and the people who used it. And it was all tax funded. They didn't want to see a diminishing of their federal and local control either. But it's not to say that probably a good example would be this in terms of profiling. An interview that I had a couple of weeks ago, the interviewer mentioned the Rolling Stones and Keith Richards, who wrote a book about his life. And in that book, he writes about his heroin use. So if you think about two heroin users, you have like someone like Keith Richards who has access to money, and someone who's poor and working class. Keith Richards can buy, or could buy back then, large amounts of his drug. It could be delivered to him. He doesn't have to go on the street. He has people, nannies and other people to care for his family if he decides to take more than what might be recommended. He has access to good lawyers if he's arrested for heroin possession, who will lead a great defense for him. Um, Think about someone who's poor. If they're using heroin on a regular basis, they have to buy that drug on the street, very visible to law enforcement, small amounts each time. They have to try to generate the income to buy the drug. And they might even then use the drug in a setting that's outside, because if they have it in their possession, they could be stopped 2 blocks down and be arrested. In the 50s, 40s, 1940s, they had no access to public drug treatment, even if they wanted to stop using the drug. And they have no access to having a good legal defense. And at that time, from 1961 on, someone who was convicted with a drug offense, including heroin, it was 7 years. And if they were convicted of dealing or trafficking, it was life imprisonment. And we still have those same laws today. So it was very rough going for poor and working class people in Canada. Prison was really the destination. And it was enforced sobriety with no supports as well, because we didn't have drug treatment. And so it was a difficult life. And we also, the federal government set up the narcotic division that actually kept files of every known drug user in Canada. And that was mostly the heroin users, cocaine users, the smaller population. And they would interfere in the prosecution of these people. They wrote letters to any doctor who prescribed them legal drugs. Yeah, so they were under high surveillance, in a way that I think is difficult for us to understand. That continued right into the 1970s, these files of each known heroin user in Canada. So tremendous amount of effort to regulate this very small population of people.
Mhm. Now, you mentioned the effects of being poor and sort of what that could have on on a person in terms of where they're able to access the drug and where they're using it. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of, as we get into the 1980s, into the 1990s, how does the HIV issue shape this? Because the idea of transmission through needles, and certainly we saw the damage that was done to the gay community in the
Mm-hmm.
1980s, 1990s, the sort of oppression that was
Yes.
associated with the fear of HIV. How does the pandemic of HIV it further influence or further marginalize those who are using heroin and perhaps even create more damage to those
Mm.
individuals?
Yeah. I should say that there's been resistance to our drug policies since the 1940s. Individuals and commissions have recommended that we set up narcotic clinics, our drug substitution clinics where people are provided a legal dose. But we've never acted on that at
Mm,
all. But the 1990s really signified a change, because the lower mainland of Vancouver, we were experiencing, a public health crisis in relation to rising HIV/AIDS and hepatitis C rates, but also rising overdose deaths. Um, and those deaths were due to drugs purchased on the illegal market, but also in the combination of consuming alcohol while using other drugs. And as that crisis emerged, people got together, and it would be what we would call a sort of harm reduction movement in the downtown east side of Vancouver, in the lower mainland of Vancouver, and the emergence of the first drug user union, VANDU, Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. And that really changed the way we think about drugs and the people who use drugs, because for the first time, people who were part of the union were being heard by the public. They were at the table when some decisions were being made about drug policy and the services that could be provided. Because you think about in Canada, our drug services were completely regulated by criminal justice. It's criminal justice or the federal government and through the narcotic division, basically telling us what kind of health services that we could have for people who used illegal drugs or other drugs. But this was the first time through the drug user union and the harm reduction activists that their voice got heard, and they demanded to be heard. And in a way that was very different than in the past, because when people who used heroin or other drugs voiced their opinion that we should legalize, currently criminalized drugs, including heroin, or that we should set up heroin clinics, they were just dismissed. Oh, of course they want drugs. What else would they say? Completely dismissed, even though they were providing, um, drawing from their own life experience, a solution that would work. So we saw this shift happen due to these three things coming together: the overdose crisis then, and the rising HIV/AIDS and hepatitis C rates. Unfortunately, we didn't do the right thing in the 1990s. Politicians as well, Libby Davis of the NDP at that time, Van Du, and others were challenging drug policy and saying, we need to decriminalize, we need to move towards legal regulation of drugs, we need to set up supervised injection sites to save lives, and we need to expand our drug substitution programs to not only be methadone maintenance clinics, which we had emerged in the 1960s. So we haven't looked back since then, but we didn't roll out the recommendations that they would have liked to have seen. And even in the report authored by Donald McPherson, the Four Pillars report, recommended that we seriously think about decriminalization and legal regulation, the opening of supervised injection sites, and the prescribing of heroin at that time. And back then, when you look at it, there was probably during the epidemic, there was possibly 300 to 400 deaths. But last year we had over 2,000 deaths in British Columbia due to this poison drug supply. And the crisis is so much larger,
Mhm.
partially because we didn't do the right thing at that time. Though, to give them credit, harm reduction activists, drug user unions across the nation have all been clamoring and advocating for this change ever since, and continue to do so today. And there's, Kaput, our National Drug User Union, launched a charter challenge in relation to our drug laws, and other groups are, you know, have advocated for compassion clubs where people could come and receive safe, tested heroin and also methamphetamine and cocaine. And these are due to the inaction at the federal and provincial and municipal level that activists have to risk their own safety and their
Sure.
time to set up, services that will in some way counter the harms of drug prohibition, but you can't expect it to rest with them, and that's why
Sure.
advocates are also saying we need a larger change in our drug laws and our policies as well, so that we can
So
curtail this.
sure, but it leads to sort of this larger question that I think shapes a lot of potentially public opinion because people look at people who are addicted to drugs, and there are some pretty nonsensical arguments against, say, supervised sites, like, oh, that just encourages people to use drugs, which I think
Mhm,
is established that that is not the case. But in
mhm,
terms of the resistance to the laws themselves and part of the movement, I do feel as though there is a portion of the population that wants something punitive But
Yes.
I would potentially argue that the punitive side of the law should go against manufacturers, should go against the people who push drugs onto others. And is that a valid concern? That is there, the people who produce drugs, and I believe there's some sort of suit right now against large pharmaceutical companies
Mhm.
related
Yeah.
to the opioid issues going on across North America, really across the world. Like, is that some sort of a hybrid legitimate solution to prosecute or go towards punitive towards manufacturers, the people who create the things,
Yeah.
while also providing safe spaces for those who are addicted to these
Yeah.
substances?
Yeah. What I would say about that, in Canada, our overdose death crisis is not related to overprescribing of legal drugs.
Mm,
And that's very clear. And if we want to have better restrictions on pharmaceutical industries and doctors prescribing, we can do that by creating federal law and restrictions. And the United States can too. But they don't want to create a overreaching law because they're all into the profit motive. So it's a failure of the state really to regulate the pharmaceutical industry, and they could do that at any time. And so I'm not actually a big supporter of going after the pharmaceutical industry. I'm a big supporter of regulating all pharmaceutical industry and making sure that we're provided safe drugs and that we regulate, prescribing as we do, but that we regulate it better so that we can see if there's anomalies in prescribing. I'm very much an advocate of changing our laws and our policies that stem from these very punitive laws because there's absolutely no evidence that punishment changes the way a person behaves, especially in relation to their drug use. So we set up this very punitive system through the Indian Act in 1876 that criminalized the non medical use of alcohol and opioids. They called it intoxicants, including heroin. And that lasted for over a century. But what it did was not stop people from using drugs recreationally or whatever, because that's what a non medical use would be. But it was a handy colonial tool to socially control indigenous people.
mm,
We took that same very punitive framework and applied it to our next drug law, which was in 1908, prohibiting the smoking of opium and opium dens. And the framework definitely is part of um, our colonial history to the present, an idea of white supremacy and Christian ideology around temperance, that the ideal citizen is a white citizen who's sober and everybody else is
yeah.
othered. Even though we don't use that language today,
Hmm.
that is the model that we've adopted,
Sure.
possibly not understanding the tenets of it or the roots of it, this idea that abstinence um, is the sort of the characteristic of the ideal citizen, and to use criminal justice punishment as a way to curtail people's behavior. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work in other crimes
Right.
outside of even drug use,
Sure.
but certainly in that area, because one of the reasons I'm opposed to the law and the policies that stem from it, too, is that, for a long time, we only saw the heroin user, people who used other criminalized drugs, as criminal. Okay.
Hmm.
And then at the late 1940s and 50s, there was some movement with psychiatry to label people who were using heroin or other drugs as pathological. Okay. And this sort of disease model of addiction emerged as well, to, sort of framing people who use drugs as having a disease. And now we talk about, disease of the brain as well. And in order to receive heroin assisted treatment or to receive hydromorphone, which is being used currently too in some drug substitution programs, Dilaudid, you have to be diagnosed as having opiate use disorder, which is in the criteria is in the DSM. But I question this idea: how can we have a law that criminalizes people And we have the DSM telling us that people who use heroin regularly, you know, have a pathology.
Right.
And so this contradiction, though, has been with us, since the late 1940s and 50s. But we don't seem to have a problem with that. But
Sure.
I would question too, it's been argued that seeing it through the DSM or having a pathology or a disease will destigmatize the person who's using drugs. But we haven't seen any evidence of that in the last few
Mhm.
decades since we started to label people as having a disease or a pathology. Um, in fact, I question the whole concept of addiction in the book. Because other scholars and are looking at the roots of the word addiction and trying to better understand why people who use drugs are labeled addicted or having a disorder, and challenge that, and also provide us with some support to see that there's many routes into drug use. There's many routes into just recreational or regular drug use, and many routes out. But there's also um, diversity in how people experience their drug use, even if it's on a regular basis. And they
Right.
point to the fact that even the DSM, the criteria for diagnosing somebody with opiate use disorder, many of them are social or cultural factors, but they're
Right.
pathologized. So I'll give you an example. One of the third criteria is spending a great deal of time obtaining or using opioids or recovering from its effect. Well, if you're buying on the illegal market and you're poor, you are spending a lot of time because you have to find ways to make money, whether it's through recycling or your poor paying job. Another one is using opioids in physically hazardous situations. But as I explained earlier, if you're buying a small amount, on the street, basically, there's a tendency to do the drugs right then, because the longer you have those drugs in your possession, the more likely that you'll be stopped by the police and
Right.
possibly arrested for possession of the drug. So the fact that we don't really look at social and cultural factors is problematic. But the other issue with that is that there's a lot of research that demonstrates that it's our the consequences of our drug use is shaped by our social status. And so if we're someone like poor Keith Richards, I'll use him again.
Mm.
But if we're someone who's wealthy, our heroin use will look quite differently, and the consequences of that heroin use will be quite different than someone who's poor or marginalized or racialized or a woman as well. The consequences will be quite different. So it's always
Right.
asking the question like, what is the drug? How is our social and cultural factors shaping a person's drug use?
Right. Yeah, and it really, even you could think about it in terms of alcohol. Someone said to me a few weeks
Yeah.
ago that if you've ever had a drink in a bar, you've had a drink in a supervised setting. In
Yes.
one of these, this is essentially a supervised consumption site, a bar, because
Yes.
the bar staff is all trained on how to spot intoxication and ensure that you
Yes.
don't overdo it. So
Right.
really, alcohol has been regulated to that point, and at the same time, people can overdo it with alcohol, and you have something like Alcoholics Anonymous amongst a whole bunch of organizations. And you can make criticisms of those organizations here and there based on their methodology, but there's this whole social structure that is intended to help people who are addicted and kind of raise them up. And you're almost, not always, there's certainly stigmas to it, but within those organizations, the idea is to cheer you on as you try to address your reliance on alcohol and slowly get off of it, because there can be damage by not using alcohol in moderation. And does the same thing actually exist for heroin, that abuse of the drug can lead to physical long-term uh,
Yeah.
problems
No.
that need to be addressed? No.
No, like alcohol and tobacco are our most toxic drugs. And so
Mhm.
clinical heroin, legal heroin, Really, the side effects are constipation, and if you use too much, death, which is the consequences of using too much alcohol or other narcotics and drugs too. Obviously, you're if heroin is provided, you'll be given a dose that isn't harmful to you at all. But I should mention too, because I think this is a fear of some people too. Our use of alcohol is quite popular in Canada. You know, though we had our temperance movements and people did die from poison alcohol during those periods,
Right.
especially the 14 years in the United States where they had alcohol prohibition. You know, the idea of a poison drug supply, we have to keep that in mind because one of the reasons that we want drugs to be regulated is that we can be assured the quality and quantity of the drug, that there's measures put in place so that when I take a Tylenol, you know, over the counter Tylenol, that I'm going to be safe when I take that.
Mhm.
And so we would question, like, why wouldn't you afford other people who are using drugs the same safety measures? But heroin was never that popular. It still isn't that popular.
Right.
You know, really, our favorite drug that was criminalized after the late 1960s was cannabis. You know, people preferred cannabis. They weren't like, it's not as if heroin wasn't available on the legal market. It is. It's not that difficult for
Mhm.
people to obtain if they want it. But I'm not in any way advocating sort of some wholesale use of heroin at all.
Right.
Advocating that we should have every tool in the toolbox in relation to providing supports to people who are using criminalized drugs, and for drug substitution programs to include heroin as one of the drugs that they might provide, because that drug might be the best for the person of concern. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that many people respond to abstinence based drug treatment, and that's great. You know, if they find that their life is more stabilized and that they're happier in their life if they abstain from a substance, that's wonderful. You know, and I think we should acknowledge that. But not everybody um, responds that way to an abstinence based treatment. And then there's nothing for them, is basically what harm reduction activists and drug user unions have been trying to express, that we have to have diverse services. And so, for that very small minority who would benefit from a drug substitution program, whether it be hydromorphone or heroin or methadone, that should be provided to people in a non stigmatizing and discriminatory
Right.
way. Or the idea that Dolph and Van Du have been advocating as well is providing compassion clubs where people can access drugs too, or legal safe drugs.
Right.
And we've just had a recent example in Vancouver, a Portland Hotel Society physician there prescribed fentanyl to a patient, where they just go to the pharmacy and they receive their fentanyl, which we know has been illegal. Fentanyl is the major drug that's affecting the poison drug um, market. But anyway, they prescribe fentanyl, legal fentanyl, to that patient so that they can decide when they want to take the drug. Because often in a drug substitution program, the program creates a framework for when you're taking the drug. So you have to come
Right.
in and get the drug and take it there, and you're supervised as well. But it's to say that we could have many different diverse ways to provide people with a legal source and to supervise that use as well, to make sure that it's working and benefiting them. Um,
Mhm.
so I think we need to understand that nobody's talking about like some huge pool of people all of a sudden starting to use heroin. I don't think that will be the case for most
No.
people. And even think about if you've had an injury and needed pain control. You know, when you go to well, I was just recently a year ago in emergency, and they immediately wanted to prescribe me hydromorphone, which is being used as a drug substitution drug here in Vancouver and elsewhere. But I can't. I can't manage that drug. It really affects me terribly. Um, which when I went down to the drug user union and told them that story, everybody just laughed at me. But it just didn't work for me in the same way, definitely.
Right.
And so, we tried another narcotic. It's to say that we all know that these narcotics, there's a potential for dependence. But for most people, that's not the case. It's just a small percentage of people
Mm,
that this might happen. If we had better education about it, I think we wouldn't see that occurring. But we all respond to drugs differently.
mm,
And so for one person, methadone or methadose might work for them. For another person, hydromorphone might be the best solution. For another, it might be legal heroin. For another person, and I think that would be the majority of people, you know, remaining abstinence from that substance might work best for them, or doing what we call now managed use. We have a drinking managed use or controlled use program in Vancouver and other places. And they're quite beneficial.
right. Yeah.
So I think we should look
Yeah.
at the end result of those studies and look around the world that are providing heroin assisted treatment. And have been ongoingly for many decades, and to learn from them and not be frightened that somehow we'll have a heroin use epidemic if we provide this kind of service to people.
Sure. Yeah, and I think too part of the pushback that to some of these things that you might see, certainly maybe from people of my generation, right? When I grew up in school, we went through things like DARE, and those prevention programs
Yeah,
were if you use drugs, you're going to be poor, you're going to die, you're going to get AIDS. Like it was really, or go to jail. Like it was all on, like the prevention programs were
yes,
leaning into these stigmatizing ideas around drug use. And prevention
yes,
programs are, I think, are probably a good idea, but maybe not structure them the way that now I'm 36 years old, and the imagery that was given to me when I was 12 is still kind of in my head about what some of the
sure,
right. So it's taken a lot of work for me to read more about these issues, to delve in deeper, to get a better sense of what's going on. And that's why books like this, I think, are very important to a general audience. As you said off the top, anybody from a teenager up until a senior
yeah,
citizen can access this book and get a real good sense of the historic basis around a lot of the drugs, as well as the resistance to them, and sort of how these issues play into a contemporary audience and the issues
that's
that
right.
we still deal with across the country.
Yeah, and I should mention that, in our different supervised injection sites and our overdose prevention sites, the OPSs that have been set up during this overdose crisis, that there's been not one overdose death. And
Right.
there's not been one overdose death in BC associated with drug substitution programs either. So we know these programs save lives. And, if we can't get beyond them, I think we could try to understand that if we want people to stay safe, if we want to stop deaths, that these are the types of programs that we need to implement across Canada at the same time that we look at the larger law and the policies that stem from it that criminalize and discriminate against people. That our law, it's quite costly with tax
Yeah.
dollars, but also that it's ineffective in a
Mm.
sense. We're still the largest category of convictions are for possession, or at least for offenses are possession, and that has been so historically. Though we saw a steep dive after the legalization of cannabis, because over the last, since the late 60s, it was cannabis offenses um, that held the majority of drug offenses in Canada. But it was always possession, So this idea that we're told all the time too that, oh, well, we're just arresting high level traffickers and dealers so that we can be safe. That's untrue. It's
Right.
always been possession, personal possession arrests that
Mhm.
make up the larger part of our drug offenses. So we should stay aware of that. But it's to say that we could have a different drug policy. we could start a small step, just decriminalizing personal possession and small amounts of selling for one's own use. We could start there, but not in isolation. I think all of the activist groups are stating that we need to roll out the drug substitution programs, OPSs, but that we also need to expand housing, healthcare,
Right.
treatment, diverse treatment, culturally sensitive treatment as well, spaces for women only, services to that we need to look at our child custody and social work practices in relation to women who use drugs and have
Mm.
children. We need better education, as you said, about drugs, because many of us did just have sort of the reefer madness kind of
Yeah,
education provided to us. And whether our drug is prescribed through our physician or over the counter drugs, we need to know what we're taking and
mhm,
what might be the benefits, but also the what we need to be careful about. And maybe talk more about our relationship with specific drugs as well. Early sociologists and talked about this idea of our relationships with drugs, that it wasn't just the drug that was important, the pharmacology of the drug. It was our expectation of that drug, our relationship with that drug, as well the social, cultural, and legal environment that we took that drug is just as important as the drug
right,
and the consequences then of our drug use, but as well. So I think everybody needs better education about
yeah,
drugs, not just possibly heroin or other narcotics, but about all drugs.
for sure.
It's
Yeah. So again, we would encourage everybody to do that by picking up the book. It is Heroin, an illustrated history. Susan, if people want a copy of it, where can they go? Where would
yeah.
you encourage them to go check it out? Yeah, if you're
Well,
watching on YouTube here, check it out. There's
I would
the
just
book
go
right
to
there.
well, if you're in the Lower Mainland, Massey Books has brought in copies of the book for the book launches tomorrow, and Canadian Drug Policy Coalition and Fernwood Publishing are hosting it. So we brought some books into Massey Bookstore. But if you're not in the Lower Mainland, then probably the best way would be just to go to Fernwood Publishing's website and you can order the book online. I think that would be the easiest way. And I think Kobo, if people use their iPads and other,
Yeah,
um, you can buy a copy of the book online that way. But if you want the paper copy, obviously just go to Fernwood. Thank
and
you.
check the show notes below, or and go over to Active History if you're on the website. I will link to everything there. Again, Heroin, an illustrated history. Susan Boyd, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
All right.